Discovered a hidden letter from my late grandfather, revealing family secrets that shook my entire life. Now, I'm left questioning everything I thought I knew. I've 26F been dating Mark 25M for about 6 months now, and everything seemed to be going fine. In fact, about 3 months ago, he moved in with me. I was excited, you know. We were still getting to know each other, and living together seemed like a natural step. Plus, he had some issues with his last place, so I offered him to move in with me until he figured things out. I wasn't charging him any rent or asking him to help with bills, and it just felt good to help him out. But here's where things get tricky. I own the building we live in. It's a 2-story house, and technically it's been in my family for a long time. My dad gifted it to me when I was 18. I know that sounds crazy, but it's not like we're super rich or anything. My dad bought it cheap from a distant relative, and he gave it to me because he thought it would be a good investment for my future. I was super grateful, and I've always tried to be humble about it. I mean, it's not something I go around telling people, you know? It feels kind of weird to bring up in conversation like, hey, by the way, I own a house, so I don't. The house is basically like 2 apartments, one on the top floor, where I live, and one on the bottom floor, which I rent out. The tenant downstairs is super chill, and I charge her $500 a month, which is honestly pretty reasonable for the area. I'm not trying to make a ton of money off her or anything. I just want to cover expenses and keep things running smoothly. Now here's the thing. I never told Mark that I owned the building. It just never came up. I didn't think it mattered, and honestly, I didn't want to make things weird between us. I mean, we were still early in our relationship, and it didn't feel like something I needed to tell him right away. Plus, I've always been careful about not flaunting it because I didn't want anyone to treat me differently because of it. So, fast forward to last Tuesday. The tenant downstairs knocks on my door and tells me her fridge isn't working. Mark's sitting on the couch in the living room, probably not paying much attention to what's going on. I go down to check it out with her, and yep, the fridge is definitely done for. She asks me what to do, and I tell her that she can go ahead and buy a new one, and I'll reimburse her for it. She's super appreciative, and we figure out the details. I go back upstairs, thinking it's all handled, and that's when Mark starts asking questions. He's like, what was that about? I tell him the fridge broke, and the tenant's getting a new one, and that I'll pay for it. Simple, right? Well, apparently not, because Mark just stares at me like I've grown a second head or something. Why are you paying for a fridge, he asks, sounding completely confused. Now at this point, I'm still not thinking much of it, so I casually say, because I'm her landlord. The fridge was there when she moved in, so it's my responsibility to replace it. And boom, that's when everything started spiraling. He looks at me wide-eyed, like I just told him I was secretly an alien or something. He's like, wait, you're her landlord? You own this place? I nod, feeling a little awkward but not thinking it's a big deal. Yeah, I own the building. My dad gave it to me when I turned 18. And then, out of nowhere, Mark starts freaking out. He's all, why didn't you tell me? How could you keep something like that from me? I try to calm him down and explain that it's not something I go around telling everyone, and I didn't think it was a huge deal. But he's not having it. He gets louder, saying, I can't believe I'm living with someone who's a landlord. Do you know how much I hate landlords? You people just use others for money. You don't care about anyone but yourselves. I was completely blindsided. I mean, yeah, I get that some landlords are terrible, but I've always tried to be fair. I don't charge crazy rent, and I actually care about my tenants' well-being. But none of that seemed to matter to him. He kept going on about how I'm just like the rest of them, and how I should have told him from the start. I tried to apologize for not telling him sooner, but it didn't help. Mark then took it a step further, saying, you should give me half of the rent you get from downstairs if you really care about me. What? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him I wasn't going to do that, and that's when he really lost it. He yelled about how I'm just greedy, using people for money, and that he couldn't believe he was with someone who owned property. He even said I'd probably let people be homeless just to make a quick buck. It was honestly one of the most ridiculous things I'd ever heard. At this point, I didn't even know what to say. I tried to keep calm and told him I wasn't like that, but he wouldn't listen. He just kept yelling and accusing me of hiding things from him. The more I tried to explain, the angrier he got. It's like something in him just snapped, and nothing I said could fix it. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him, leaving me standing there in shock. I didn't know what to do. Was I really the bad guy here? All because I didn't tell him I owned the place? It wasn't like I was hiding it on purpose. I just didn't think it mattered yet. And now it's blown up into this massive issue. I tried texting him afterward to apologize again and explain that I never meant to hurt him by not telling him about the building. But he didn't respond. It's been a few days now, and I still haven't heard from him. I'm starting to wonder if I completely messed things up by not being upfront with him. But also, his reaction seemed pretty extreme, right? Like, yeah, I could have mentioned it sooner, but demanding half of the rent? That's just, I don't know. I'm honestly at a loss here, and now I'm just sitting here wondering if I'm really the one in the wrong, or if this was just never going to work from the start. So, was I really the a-hole for not telling him I owned the building? Alright, so after everything went down with Mark freaking out about me owning the building, I thought maybe he'd cool off, you know? Like take a few days, think about things, and maybe we could have a normal conversation. But nah, that's not what happened at all. A couple of days after our argument, Mark comes back. He didn't text or call beforehand, just showed up like nothing was wrong. At first, I was kind of hopeful that he was ready to talk things out like an adult. But boy, was I wrong. The second he walked in, I could feel the tension in the air. He wasn't smiling, and he wasn't exactly calm. It was like he'd spent the last 2 days stewing in his anger, and now he was ready to unload on me again. He didn't even ask how I was or anything. He just stood there in the doorway, arms crossed, staring at me like I was the one who'd done something terrible. I tried to break the ice a little, being like, hey, I'm glad you're here. Can we talk about what happened? But before I could even finish my sentence, Mark cuts me off. I've been thinking about everything, he says real cold, and I want half of the rent money from downstairs. I just stared at him for a second, not sure if he was serious or not. I mean, I knew he'd mentioned it when he was angry the other night, but I didn't actually think he was going to double down on that. But here he was, standing in front of me, demanding I give him half of the rent from a tenant who, by the way, had absolutely nothing to do with him. So I just said, what? You can't be serious. And he goes, why not? If we're in a relationship, everything should be 50-50 THS, right? So why shouldn't I get half of what you make from renting out the apartment? If you really care about me, you'd share that with me. At this point, I could feel my blood starting to boil. Like, I get that we're in a relationship, but that doesn't mean he automatically gets to claim my income, especially from a property he didn't even know existed until a few days ago. It wasn't like we were married or had some kind of joint financial agreement. He was just my boyfriend, and we'd only been together for 6 months. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, and said, Mark, you can't just demand money from me because we're dating. I've been fair to you. I haven't asked you to pay rent. I've split groceries with you, and I've let you live here without asking for anything extra. Why do you think you deserve half of the rent? That's when things took a turn. Mark, instead of answering me, starts going off on this weird rant about how landlords are the scum of the earth, how people like me don't care about anyone but ourselves, and how I was just using people for money. He went on and on about how he never thought he'd be with someone who owned property, because in his eyes, that made me a part of the problem. It was like he was completely forgetting the fact that I wasn't even charging him rent to live here. But somehow, in his mind, I was the villain. And now, on top of that, he wanted a cut of the rent, as if that would somehow make me a better person in his eyes. I just stood there trying to process everything he was saying, and honestly, it was hard to keep up because he was jumping from one point to another, barely giving me a chance to respond. Every time I tried to explain my side, he'd interrupt, accusing me of being selfish and greedy. It was like talking to a brick wall. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to raise my voice a bit to get him to stop. Mark, I said, this isn't about rent money. This is about trust. You're acting like I kept this huge secret from you, but I never lied to you. I didn't think it was relevant to our relationship yet. And honestly, I didn't think you'd react like this, but now you're turning it into something ugly. He just shook his head, like he couldn't believe what I was saying. You don't get it, he snapped. If you really cared about me, you'd share everything with me. And if you won't, then maybe I need to rethink this whole relationship. That hit me hard. Like, really? This was what our relationship had come down to? Money? I wasn't expecting that at all. It was like the person I'd been dating for the past 6 months had completely changed overnight, and I didn't even recognize him anymore. I tried one last time to reason with him. I told him that I wasn't going to give him half of the rent money, not because I didn't care about him, but because it was unreasonable. I said we could figure out a way to work through this, but only if he could meet me halfway and stop with the demands. But he just stared at me, cold and distant, and said, "If you won't share, then I guess we're done." My heart sank. I couldn't believe it had come to this. I told him that if that's how he felt, maybe it was better if he left. I wasn't going to be in a relationship where I was being manipulated over money. I didn't want to kick him out, but he left me no choice. Mark didn't say anything after that. He just turned around, grabbed his jacket, and walked out the door. No goodbye, no explanation, nothing. Just like that, he was gone. I sat down on the couch, feeling a mix of anger and sadness. How did things get so bad so quickly? One minute we were fine, and the next he was demanding money from me like I owed him something. I didn't know what to do next. Should I try to talk to him again? Should I just let it go and move on? Part of me wanted to reach out and see if we could fix things. But the other part of me knew that if he was willing to throw everything away over this, maybe it wasn't worth saving. I guess I never expected things to end this way, and I didn't know what to do next. But for now, I just needed some space to think. So after Mark stormed out that day, I honestly didn't know what to do next. I mean, part of me was still in shock over the whole thing. Like, how do we go from living together all chill to him demanding half my rent money and leaving? It just felt surreal. I wasn't really sure if we were officially broken up or if he'd come back and we'd talk things out. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that things had already crossed a line I couldn't ignore. A few days passed, and I hadn't heard from him at all. No texts, no calls. He was totally radio silent, and honestly, I was kind of relieved. I needed some space to figure out what the hell just happened and how I felt about everything. But then, out of nowhere, he started texting me again, and not with any apology or explanation. Instead, he sent me this long, ranting message saying that I was the one who needed to apologize to him. He said I'd betrayed him by not being upfront about the building, and that I was selfish for not wanting to share my money with him. He even accused me of using him, which made zero sense because I never asked him for anything. Like, dude, you've been living here rent-free, and you think I'm the one using you? I didn't even know how to respond at first. The whole thing just fell off. His messages weren't about working things out or trying to understand each other. It was just more of the same anger and accusations. He kept throwing around phrases like, "If you really love me, you do this," and "you're acting like a typical greedy landlord," and it was honestly exhausting. I started to feel like this was less about me and more about his issues with landlords in general. Like, he wasn't even seeing me as his girlfriend anymore, just some symbol for everything he hated. But then things took a turn that really freaked me out. Mark started hinting that if I didn't give him what he wanted, he'd start telling people about me. He said he'd make sure all our mutual friends knew that I was just like all the other landlords who screw people over, and that I was hiding things from him. He made it sound like he was going to drag my name through the mud to anyone who'd listen. And for what? Because I didn't give him rent money he wasn't entitled to in the first place? That's when I realized this wasn't just some stupid argument about money anymore. This was turning into manipulation and threats, and I wasn't going to stand for that. I knew I needed to do something to protect myself, so I called my dad. I explained everything to him. How Mark had been acting, the crazy demands for money, and now the threats to ruin my reputation. My dad was pissed, but in that calm, controlled way that dads get when they're ready to handle business. He told me he'd come over and sit in his car outside, just in case things got worse. I didn't think Mark would actually show up, but I wanted to be prepared just in case. Later that night, while I was watching TV and trying to distract myself, I heard a knock on the door. I peeked through the peephole, and sure enough, it was Mark. My heart started racing because I had no idea what kind of mood he was in or what he was going to say. But I wasn't going to hide from him, so I opened the door and let him in. The tension was thick as soon as he walked in. He didn't say anything right away, just stood there with this weird look on his face. I offered him to sit down, and he finally broke the silence. "So, have you thought about what I said?" His voice was low, like he was trying to stay calm, but could explode at any second. I didn't beat around the bush. "Yeah, I have. And I'm not giving you half of the rent money, Mark. That's not happening." He looked at me like I'd slapped him. "Seriously? After everything we've been through, you're still going to be selfish like this?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mark, I'm not being selfish. I've been more than fair to you. You've been living here for free. I haven't asked you to pay rent or bills. And now you're acting like I owe you something. But I don't. You're not entitled to my income just because we're in a relationship. That's when he really lost it. He stood up, pacing around the room, raising his voice. I can't believe this. I can't believe I've been with someone this greedy. You don't even care about us, do you? You just care about your damn money. I tried to stay calm, but my patience was wearing thin. Mark, this isn't about money. This is about trust and respect. You're making this all about you, and I don't get it. Why is this such a big deal to you? He stopped pacing and turned to me, his face red with anger. Because I thought we were a team. I thought you cared about me enough to share everything. But clearly I was wrong. At this point, I was done trying to reason with him. It was clear he wasn't going to listen, no matter what I said. So I told him flat out, if you're going to keep demanding money from me and threatening to ruin my reputation, then this isn't going to work. I'm not going to be in a relationship where I'm manipulated like this. Mark didn't take that well. He started yelling, calling me names, saying that I was throwing everything away over a little bit of money. It was like he couldn't see the bigger picture. This wasn't about the rent anymore. It was about the way he was treating me. But he wasn't listening. He was too wrapped up in his anger and his weird sense of entitlement to even hear what I was saying. That's when I texted my dad, letting him know Mark was here, and things were getting heated. My dad texted back, saying he was outside and ready if I needed him. Mark kept ranting for a few more minutes, but then out of nowhere, he just stopped. He looked at me, shook his head, and said, I can't believe I wasted my time with you. He stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind him. I stood there for a minute, trying to process what just happened. I didn't feel relief right away, just kind of numb. I knew things were over, but it still didn't feel real. I walked over to the window and saw my dad's car parked outside. I waved to let him know I was okay, and he texted me to check in. I told him I was fine, but I wasn't sure if I really was. Mark was gone, and I knew there was no going back after this. But even though I felt weirdly empty in that moment, I also knew deep down that I'd done the right thing. After Mark stormed out that night, I was left sitting there on the couch, feeling like my brain was doing cartwheels. You know that feeling when something major just happened, but you're still trying to wrap your head around it? That's where I was. It wasn't just that Mark had left, it was everything leading up to it. I mean, how did it go from us being fine to him demanding money, and then leaving like it was nothing? I spent the next couple of days just trying to process everything. I didn't hear from him, and honestly, I didn't try to reach out either. It felt like this massive weight had been lifted, but at the same time, I was still confused. How could someone I thought I knew so well flip like that? Part of me kept going back over our relationship, wondering if there were signs I missed, or if this whole landlord thing really just pushed him over the edge. But no matter how much I thought about it, I couldn't make sense of his reaction. Anyway, a few days later, Mark texted me. But it wasn't an apology or an attempt to talk things out like I had half hoped. Nope. He was just being, well, petty. He starts off with this super cold text, something like, let me know when I can come pick up my stuff. No, hey, how are you? Or can we talk? Just straight to the point. Honestly, I didn't know how to feel about it. So I text back, keeping it just as short. Come by whenever you're free. I'll leave your things in a box by the door. I wasn't trying to be rude, but I also didn't want to deal with a face-to-face argument if he was still in that angry mode. Mark showed up a couple of hours later. I had packed all his stuff neatly in a box like I said I would, and I left it by the front door. I stayed inside, sitting on the couch pretending to watch TV. But my heart was racing. I wasn't sure if he'd knock, try to talk, or just take his things and leave. Sure enough, I hear a knock. It wasn't loud or anything, just kind of there like he was checking to see if I'd come to the door. I debated for a second. Do I open it? Do I ignore it? But eventually I got up and opened it. I didn't want things to end without at least some closure. There he was, standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking way more calm than the last time I saw him. For a second, I thought maybe he was going to apologize, or at least explain why he acted the way he did. But instead, he just glanced at the box and said, that's it? I nodded. Yeah, that's everything. He didn't say anything for a few seconds, just kind of stared at the ground. Then he looked up and said, I thought we had something good, but clearly you care more about money than us. That hit me hard. It was like he didn't even understand the real issue here. I wasn't the one obsessed with money. He was the one who made this whole thing about money in the first place. But I was tired of fighting. I didn't want to argue anymore. Mark, this was never about money, I said, trying to stay calm. This was about trust and how you handled the situation. I never asked you for rent. I never asked you to pay for anything, but you turned this into something ugly. I didn't hide owning the building to hurt you. I just didn't think it mattered. But the way you reacted, it's like you didn't even care about me, just what I could give you. He scoffed like I had said something ridiculous. You're still not getting it, are you? I don't care about the money. I care about being with someone who's open and honest. You hid something huge from me, and now you're acting like I'm the bad guy for wanting what's fair. I took a deep breath, realizing that no matter what I said, he wasn't going to get it. It was like we were speaking two different languages. Mark, we clearly see things differently. I'm sorry you feel like I wasn't honest, but I've already apologized for not telling you sooner. That's all I can do. If you're still mad, then maybe this isn't going to work out. He looked at me for a long time, like he was waiting for me to change my mind or say something different. But I didn't. I couldn't. This whole situation had shown me a side of him that I didn't like, and I wasn't about to cave just to keep the peace. Finally, he picked up the box and said, I guess this is it then. I nodded. Yeah, I guess so. He turned to leave, but then he stopped and looked back at me one last time. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice low but serious. You're going to regret this. I didn't say anything. I just stood there as he walked away, carrying his stuff with him. And when he was gone, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, maybe a little anger too. But mostly I felt like I had done the right thing, even if it didn't feel great in the moment. After he left, I sat down and took a deep breath. This whole situation had been a mess, but at least it was over. I wasn't sure what the next step was, but I knew that staying in a relationship where I was constantly questioned and made to feel guilty for something that wasn't even wrong wasn't healthy. Mark had made his choice, and I'd made mine. It was time to move on, even if it was going to be hard. I wasn't going to let someone make me feel like I owed them something, just because we were dating. Relationships should be about trust and respect, not money or manipulation. And maybe I had learned that the hard way, but at least now I knew where I stood. I spent the rest of the evening just trying to relax, letting everything sink in. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I was ready to move forward without the drama, without the manipulation. It was time to focus on myself and let go of the negativity that had been weighing me down. After Mark left with his box of stuff, I figured that was it. We'd both move on, and I could finally just get some peace without dealing with his constant drama about the rent or the house or whatever else he wanted to argue about. But of course, it didn't end as cleanly as I thought it would. A few days went by, and honestly, I started to feel a little better. It was weird at first, not having him around, but there was also a sense of relief. Like I wasn't walking on eggshells in my own house anymore. I could just breathe. I threw myself into work and spent time with friends, trying to distract myself and not think about everything that went down. I figured the whole situation with Mark would just fade away, but nope, Mark wasn't about to let that happen. It started small. He'd text me random stuff like, I forgot my charger at your place, or can you send me that hoodie I left in the closet? I'd respond, but only to keep things civil, like sure, I'll leave it by the door. I wasn't trying to get into any more arguments, but every time we texted, he'd slip in these passive-aggressive comments. Stuff like, guess it's nice being a landlord and having everything taken care of, or must be great living rent-free in your own building. I tried to ignore it, not taking the bait, but it was getting frustrating. Like, dude, we broke up. Can we just leave it at that? But then things escalated. One day, I get a message from a mutual friend. Let's call her Jen. Jen tells me that Mark's been talking about me behind my back. He's been telling people I'm this greedy landlord who kicked him out because I didn't want to share my rent money with him. I was floored. Like what? That's not even remotely what happened. But according to Jen, he was going around spinning this story like I was some kind of heartless, money-hungry monster, and I couldn't believe it. I wasn't sure how to handle it. Do I confront him? Do I let it go? I didn't want to feed into his drama, but at the same time, I didn't want people thinking I was the bad guy here. I talked to my close friends, and they reassured me that anyone who knew me wouldn't believe Mark's nonsense. Still, it bothered me. It was like he couldn't just leave it alone and move on. He had to make it into this big thing. Eventually, I decided to reach out to him, just to clear the air and hopefully put an end to the gossip. I didn't want to fight. I just wanted him to stop talking about me like I was the villain. So I texted him something simple like, hey, can we talk? I've heard some things, and I'd like to clear things up. He responded almost immediately, which surprised me. What's there to clear up? He wrote, everything I've said is true. You didn't want to share with me. So now everyone knows the real you. I took a deep breath, trying not to get worked up. Mark, that's not how things went down, and you know it. We broke up because you made unreasonable demands, not because I'm greedy. Can we just agree to stop talking about each other and move on? His next message was full of sarcasm. All right, I'm the unreasonable one for wanting what's fair. You're the one who hid things from me, remember? At that point, I realized he wasn't going to back down. No matter what I said, he was determined to paint himself as the victim and me as the villain. I wasn't going to convince him otherwise, so I decided it was better to just leave it alone. I texted back, I'm done with this, Mark. I wish you the best, but I'm not going to engage in this anymore. And that was that. I blocked his number after that conversation, not because I wanted to cut him off completely, but because I knew there was no point in continuing the back and forth. It wasn't healthy for either of us, and I didn't want to be sucked into any more drama. But the thing is, it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, I heard from a couple more people that Mark was still talking about me. He was telling anyone who would listen that I was some terrible person who led him on and used him. It hurt, honestly, because I didn't think things would end this way. We'd had good times together, and now all of that was erased, replaced by this bitter mess. One of my friends, let's call him Alex, finally stepped in. He'd known both of us during our relationship, and he wasn't having any of Mark's nonsense. Alex told me he confronted Mark at a party, telling him to knock it off and stop dragging my name through the mud. According to Alex, Mark didn't take it well, got defensive, and stormed out. But at least someone was standing up for me. After that, the rumors seemed to die down. I think most people just got tired of hearing Mark rant, and they could see through his version of events. I started to feel a little more at ease, like maybe this was finally behind me. In the end, the whole thing was exhausting. I had never expected a breakup to turn into such a mess, especially not over something as stupid as rent money. But at the same time, it was eye-opening. I realized that I had been in a relationship with someone who didn't respect me or my boundaries, and I was better off without him. Yeah, it hurt at first, and dealing with the aftermath was stressful, but I came out of it knowing my worth and what I wouldn't tolerate going forward. Looking back, I guess I'm glad things happened the way they did, even if it sucked at the time. It showed me that some people aren't who you think they are, and that's okay. You live, you learn, and you move on. And honestly, I'm just relieved it's all over. Mark's out of my life, the rumors have died down, and I'm finally feeling like I can breathe again. And next time, I'll be a lot more careful about who I let into my space, literally and figuratively. Update. So, after all the drama with Mark finally started to die down, I thought that would be the end of it. I was ready to just move on, focus on myself, and forget about everything. But of course, life had other plans. One day, out of nowhere, I got a message from a number I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it might be spam, but when I opened it, I realized it was Mark's mom. I hadn't spoken to her much during our relationship, so this was totally unexpected. Her message was super long, and honestly, I had to read it a couple of times to really understand what she was trying to say. Basically, she was asking me to give Mark another chance. She said he was going through a tough time, and that he wasn't himself when all this stuff went down between us. She went on about how he's been struggling with work, money, and some personal stuff, and how that probably contributed to him lashing out at me. She even threw in a line about how she thought we made a great couple, and it would be a shame to throw it all away over a misunderstanding. I was honestly shocked. I hadn't expected Mark to get his mom involved, but maybe he was more upset about our breakup than I realized. Still, I wasn't about to let that change anything. What happened between Mark and me wasn't just some misunderstanding like his mom was saying. It was about trust and how he treated me. So I took some time to think about how I wanted to respond. I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to give her any hope that we could get back together. After a bit, I messaged her back and said something like, I really appreciate your message, but I think Mark and I are better off apart. There's a lot that went wrong between us, and I don't think getting back together would fix any of that. I wish him the best, but I've moved on. I kept it respectful, but I made sure to be clear that I wasn't interested in rekindling anything with Mark. After I sent the message, I kind of expected her to push back, but surprisingly, she didn't. She just replied saying she understood, and that she hoped we could both find happiness in our own ways. That was the end of that, and honestly, I was relieved it didn't turn into more drama. The whole situation with Mark and his mom reaching out made me realize even more that I made the right choice. If he couldn't handle things maturely and had to get his family involved, it just showed me that he wasn't ready for the kind of relationship I wanted. It was hard to end things, but at the end of the day, I was glad I stood my ground and didn't let him drag me into any more of his mess. Now, I'm just focused on myself and what's ahead. It feels good to finally put everything with Mark behind me for good.